You'll work under my nephew. Julianne Mercer said it as if she were announcing a promotion, not changing the chain of responsibility for the most important client program in the company. Wesley Hart sat across from her in the glass conference room, his coat folded over the back of his chair, a half-finished coffee beside his notebook. Through the windows, Denver was turning gold beneath a cold October sky. Grant will have final approval, Julianne continued. You'll remain responsible for client delivery. Wesley looked at the organizational chart on the screen. His name was still beside every major account. Grant's name was now above his. If I'm responsible for delivery, Wesley said, what happens when I disagree with a decision that affects the client? Julianne didn't hesitate. Grant makes the final call. Wesley nodded slowly. That was the answer he had been afraid of. His job was built around catching problems before they reached the customer. He had spent 11 years learning that a decision made quickly was not necessarily a decision made well. So I own the outcome, he said, but not the decision. Julianne's expression hardened. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Maybe she was right. Maybe Wesley had become too cautious. He had heard that criticism before. But caution had also kept clients from discovering problems after contracts were signed. He glanced at the folder in front of him. Inside was the transition plan for a major utility account, a project worth more money than Wesley cared to think about. He had one goal that morning: protect the client relationship and make sure his team could deliver what they promised. Now he had to decide whether staying was worth accepting responsibility without authority. If you're watching, how old are you? Where are you watching from? And have you ever been asked to take responsibility for something you weren't allowed to control? Wesley closed the folder. I can work with Grant, he said. I can disagree with him. I can support him. But I can't put my name behind a decision I'm not allowed to challenge. Julianne leaned back. Are you refusing the new structure? Wesley looked at her. He thought about his son, Nolan, waiting for him at home that evening. He thought about the mortgage, the school schedule, the stability he had worked years to build. Walking away would hurt. Staying might be worse. Yes, he said quietly. I am. Julianne stared at him. Then what are you asking for? Wesley stood and picked up his coat. Nothing. That answer surprised her. He wasn't asking for more money. He wasn't asking for a better title. He wasn't even asking her to remove Grant. He was choosing not to accept a responsibility he could no longer carry honestly. Wesley walked toward the door. Behind him, Julianne said, You're really willing to leave over this? He stopped for a moment. I'm willing to leave because I know what my name means when it's on the result. Then he walked out. Downstairs, his phone buzzed. A message from Nolan. Dad, are you picking me up after school? Wesley looked at the screen, took a breath, and typed back. Always. By the time Wesley reached Nolan's elementary school, the sun was already dropping behind the foothills. The October air had turned sharp, and Wesley pulled the zipper of his dark jacket higher as he waited beside the pickup lane. He had spent the entire drive telling himself he had made a professional decision. A reasonable decision. The kind of decision a person could explain without sounding emotional. Then Nolan climbed into the passenger seat and ruined all of that with one question. Did you quit? Wesley glanced at him in the mirror. Not exactly. Nolan buckled his seatbelt. That sounds like yes. Wesley smiled despite himself. I resigned. Why? Work changed. Nolan considered that. Did they make you mad? A little. Did you make them mad? Wesley laughed softly. Probably. That answer seemed to satisfy him. They stopped at the grocery store before heading home. Wesley moved quickly through the aisles, checking the list on his phone while Nolan pushed the cart. Chicken, milk, bread, apples. The cereal Nolan liked. Nothing extravagant. Wesley had always been careful with money, not because they were struggling, but because being a single parent meant knowing exactly what could and could not be postponed. At home, Wesley changed out of his office clothes and put on a faded blue sweater and jeans. Nolan started his homework at the kitchen table while Wesley prepared dinner. For a while, the evening felt completely ordinary. That was what Wesley needed. Not a speech, not a dramatic phone call, just an hour where nobody asked him what he was going to do next. But after dinner, his phone lit up on the counter. A message from his former operations manager. Grant moved the client review to tomorrow morning. Wesley read it twice. He wasn't surprised. Grant had always preferred moving quickly. What bothered him was the timing. The client review involved the same utility account Wesley had been preparing for weeks. There were 3 unresolved items that could affect the final transition schedule. Wesley had documented each one. He had also flagged the order in which they needed to be handled. If Grant changed the sequence without checking with the technical teams, the client might hear one promise while the engineers were preparing for another. Wesley put the phone down. Nolan looked up from his homework. "Are you still working?" "No." Wesley picked up the phone again. "Not anymore." He opened the draft transition plan. His finger hovered over the message box. He could send Grant a warning. He could explain the risks. He could spend another hour helping the company avoid a mistake even though he had already resigned. Part of him wanted to. That was his flaw. Wesley had spent years believing that if he could see a problem coming, he was responsible for stopping it, even when the problem technically belonged to someone else. He started typing. "Before tomorrow's review, make sure engineering confirms the revised equipment schedule. The client should not receive a commitment until..." He stopped. He deleted the message. Not because he wanted the company to fail, because he finally understood the boundary he had been trying to explain that afternoon. If Grant now had final authority, Grant also had to be allowed to carry the responsibility that came with it. Wesley locked his phone. "Dad," Nolan asked. "Yeah." "Are you going to get another job?" Wesley looked at his son, then toward the dark window above the sink. "I'm going to figure out what kind of job makes sense for us." Nolan nodded. "Can I still play soccer Saturday?" Wesley smiled. "Absolutely." Later that night, after Nolan was asleep, Wesley opened the small notebook he kept beside his desk. He wrote down the accounts he had been responsible for, then the names of the people who depended on those accounts. He didn't write a plan to return. He wrote a question instead. What am I actually responsible for now? For the first time in years, the answer wasn't clear. And strangely, that uncertainty felt less like fear than freedom. Grant Mercer arrived at the client review 15 minutes early, carrying a tablet and the kind of confidence that made people sit straighter when he entered a room. Wesley wasn't there. For the first time in years, nobody had prepared the meeting from the middle outward, making sure engineering, field operations, compliance, and the client were all looking at the same version of reality. Grant didn't see the problem. He saw an opportunity to move faster. "Let's keep this simple," he said when the client joined the call. "We're ready to confirm the revised deployment schedule." Across the screen, the client's operations director frowned. "The revised schedule? We haven't approved that date." Grant glanced at his tablet. "Our team has." A brief silence followed. "Which team?" Grant looked toward his staff. No one answered immediately. The meeting ended 20 minutes later with no agreement. It wasn't a disaster. Not yet. But the first crack had appeared. At home that evening, Wesley was helping Nolan build a model bridge across the kitchen table. His phone remained face down beside him. He had received 4 messages since lunch. 2 were from former coworkers. 1 was from a client contact. The last was from his former assistant, Dana. The meeting didn't go well. Wesley read it, then set the phone down. Nolan held up 2 pieces of plastic. "This one goes here." Wesley studied the model. "Are you sure?" "Yeah." "What happens if it doesn't fit?" Nolan shrugged. "Then we move it." Wesley smiled. "Fair enough." The next morning, another message arrived. "Grant wants all transition notes archived." Wesley understood what that meant. The company was closing the door behind him. He didn't blame them. He had chosen to leave. Still, there was something uncomfortable about knowing that people were now making decisions with information he had spent years organizing. Wesley opened his old files one final time. He could see every dependency in the major client accounts. Engineering approvals tied to field schedules tied to customer training tied to compliance. None of it belonged to him anymore. He shut the laptop. Meanwhile, Julianne sat in her office reviewing Grant's first-week performance report. The numbers looked good. Faster approvals. Fewer internal meetings. Shorter decision cycles. Exactly what Grant had promised. She smiled and forwarded the report to the board. Then she opened a client satisfaction note from the same account. One sentence stood out. "We need one person who understands the entire transition, not 6 people explaining their individual pieces." Julianne stared at it. She remembered Wesley saying something similar months earlier. She had dismissed it as his preference for control. Now she wasn't so sure. She called Grant. "How are things with the client?" "Fine," he said. "They just need to adjust to the new process." "Are they comfortable?" "They'll be fine." Julianne looked again at the client note. "Make sure they are." After the call, she walked to the window. Denver's evening sky had turned pale gray, and wind pushed dry leaves across the street below. She had wanted new leadership. She had believed Wesley needed to learn how to let go. Perhaps he had. Perhaps the person who hadn't learned how to let go was her. Across town, Wesley closed Nolan's bedroom door after saying goodnight. He returned to the kitchen and found another message waiting. This one came from an old colleague. They want you back on the account tomorrow. Wesley stared at the screen. Then he put the phone down without replying. He wasn't ready to return. Not because he wanted the company to struggle. He simply wasn't willing to step back into the same responsibility, without the authority to match it. For the first time, walking away wasn't about proving a point. It was about deciding what he was willing to be responsible for. The first sign that the new structure was failing came from a customer who had never complained before. Julianne was sitting in her office when the account director placed a printed email on her desk. They want to pause the next phase. Julianne looked up. Why? They say they're getting different answers from different teams. She read the message again. The problem wasn't a missed deadline or a broken system. It was uncertainty. Engineering had one schedule. Field operations had another. Compliance had not approved the latest change. Grant had approved a client commitment based on information that was technically accurate, but incomplete. Julianne called him immediately. What's happening with the account? Grant answered with confidence. We're tightening the process. The client wants to pause. They're nervous because we're changing how they work with us. Julianne looked at the email. They're not asking for a different process. They're asking for one answer. Grant paused. I'll handle it. She ended the call. For the first time, she didn't feel reassured. She felt responsible. Across town, Wesley was standing in the kitchen helping Nolan tape cardboard walls onto a school project. He had spent the morning making calls about his next job. Nothing had worked out yet, and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Wesley liked being useful. He liked knowing what came next. Now his calendar was almost empty. His phone buzzed again. It was Dana. Can you take a quick look at something? Wesley stared at the message. He almost ignored it. Then another message arrived. Not asking you to come back. Just need your perspective. Wesley called her. What's wrong? Dana explained the client issue. Wesley listened without interrupting. Then he asked 3 questions. Which schedule did engineering approve? Which version did the client receive? Who had authority to reconcile the difference? Dana went quiet. That's the problem, she said. Nobody. Wesley leaned against the kitchen counter. He could have solved the immediate issue in 10 minutes. He knew exactly who needed to talk to whom. But he stopped himself. Then don't ask me to fix it, he said. Ask the company why nobody owns the handoff. Dana was silent. You really mean that? I do. After the call, Wesley put his phone away. Nolan looked up from his project. Was that work? Kind of. Did you fix it? Wesley smiled. No, Nolan frowned. Why not? Wesley considered the question. Because sometimes fixing something for someone doesn't help them learn how to fix it themselves. He returned to the cardboard model. At the company, Julianne gathered Grant, engineering, field operations, compliance, and the account team in one room. For the first time since Wesley left, she refused to let them leave until they had agreed on one version of the transition plan. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. Everyone had a reason. Everyone had a document. Everyone believed their piece was correct. But when the pieces were placed together, the gaps were obvious. Julianne finally asked the question Wesley had been asking for years. Who owns the space between these departments? Nobody answered. She looked around the room. Grant finally said, My office does. Julianne shook her head. Then why didn't you know about the compliance delay? Grant had no answer. That night, Julianne stayed late. She opened Wesley's old transition notes, not to find a solution, but to understand what he had been doing that nobody had formally recognized. There were no secret formulas, no genius shortcuts, just pages of questions, dependencies, names, and decisions that had to happen in a particular order. At the bottom of one page, Wesley had written a sentence Julianne remembered seeing before. A handoff isn't complete when information leaves one team. It's complete when the next team can act on it. Julianne closed her eyes. She had mistaken Wesley's caution for resistance. Maybe he hadn't been trying to protect his territory. Maybe he had been protecting the space between people. The next morning, she called him. Wesley answered after the second ring. Julianne, I need to talk to you. About the account. About what? Happens when you're not there. Wesley was quiet. That's exactly what I wanted you to figure out. Julianne's call stayed on Wesley's mind longer than he expected. Not because he wanted to hear her admit he had been right, but because she had asked a different question this time. She hadn't asked him to fix the client account. She had asked what happened when he wasn't there. Wesley understood the difference. The next morning, he dropped Nolan at school under a pale October sky, then drove to a small co-working office downtown where he had rented a desk for the week. He was beginning to explore consulting work, though he still wasn't sure he wanted to build a business. Being a single dad had taught him not to make major decisions just because uncertainty made him uncomfortable. He wanted work that left enough room for Nolan. He wanted responsibility he could actually own. And, if he was honest with himself, he wanted to prove that walking away hadn't been a mistake. His phone rang. "Julianne, I'm not asking you to come back," she said before he could speak. "Good. I need you to explain something." Wesley leaned back in his chair. "What? Why did the old system work when you were there?" Wesley thought for a moment. "It didn't always work." "That's not what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" "Everyone says you kept the departments aligned. I assumed that was just your management style." Wesley looked through the window at traffic moving along the street. "It wasn't a style. It was a habit." "Explain." "Whenever engineering changed something, I made sure the client team knew before they made a promise. Whenever sales changed a promise, I made sure engineering knew before someone scheduled the work. I wasn't approving everything. I was making sure nobody made a commitment in isolation." Julianne was quiet. "Why wasn't that written into the structure?" Wesley gave a small laugh. "Because nobody thinks about a bridge when they're standing on it." The line stayed with her. Later that afternoon, Julianne asked Grant to show her the new approval process. He opened a dashboard proudly. Every decision had an owner. Every department had a clear chain of command. It looked efficient. Julianne pointed to a client change request. "Who reviewed this with compliance?" Grant checked the screen. "Compliance has access." "That's not what I asked." He frowned. "They can see it." "Did they approve it?" Grant searched. "Not yet." Julianne looked at him. "Then why did the client receive a commitment?" Grant's confidence faded slightly. "Because we couldn't wait for every department." Julianne nodded. "That's exactly the problem." Grant pushed back. "Wesley made everyone wait for everything. We were trying to move faster. And now we're moving faster in different directions." The words landed harder than she intended. Grant sat back. He wasn't incompetent. He had simply been given authority without enough understanding of the system he was supposed to lead. That evening, Julianne visited the client site herself. She expected anger. Instead, the client operations manager walked her through the problem. "We don't need Wesley back," he said. "We need someone who can make one decision stick across all the teams." Julianne looked at the equipment floor below. The system was still running. Nothing dramatic had failed. The problem was more subtle. People had stopped trusting that one department's answer would still be valid after another department changed something. On the drive home, Julianne called her chief operating officer. "How many people can approve a client commitment?" she asked. "Depends on the account." "And who is accountable when those approvals conflict?" There was a pause. "That's less clear." Julianne ended the call. At the same time, Wesley was sitting at his kitchen table helping Nolan with a science assignment. Nolan held up a small bridge made from craft sticks. "Mine keeps bending." Wesley examined it. "Where's the support?" Nolan pointed to one side. "Here." Wesley shook his head. "You need support in the middle too." Nolan added another piece. The bridge held. Wesley smiled. He looked at the little structure and thought about the company. Maybe the problem had never been that one person was indispensable. Maybe the problem was that everyone had been relying on one person to provide support that should have been built into the system. For the first time, Wesley saw a future that didn't require him to return. He could let the company solve its own problem. And if Julianne wanted his help, she would have to understand that before he ever considered saying yes. By Friday morning, the client had frozen the next phase of the contract. There was no dramatic announcement, no angry press release, and no single mistake anyone could point to. The account simply stopped moving. Julianne stood at the end of a conference table while 6 department heads argued over which handoff had failed. Engineering had followed its approved design. Compliance had completed its review. Operations had scheduled the field work according to the latest plan. Sales had communicated the date the client had been given. Every team could defend its own decision. That was exactly what frightened Julianne. "Who owns the whole transition?" she asked. Silence spread around the room. Grant finally answered. "My division owns it." Julianne looked at him. "Then who makes sure these teams are working from the same information?" Grant glanced at the documents in front of him. They should be. That wasn't my question. Nobody spoke. Julianne looked at the client freeze notice again. The account was worth millions, but the money wasn't the part that bothered her most. The client had stopped trusting them. That was harder to repair. Across town, Wesley was sitting at his rented desk when Julianne called. The account is frozen, she said. Wesley closed his laptop. I'm sorry to hear that. I need your advice. About the client? About the structure. Wesley was quiet for a moment. What did you change? Julianne explained the new approval chain. Wesley listened carefully. He didn't interrupt when she described Grant's centralized model, the shorter meetings, and the faster approvals. When she finished, he asked, who has authority to stop a commitment before it reaches the client? Grant. And who has authority to change the technical plan afterward? Engineering. And who has authority to change the field schedule? Operations. Then you don't have one decision owner, Wesley said. You have several owners, fighting over the same outcome. Julianne leaned back in her chair. Can you come in and help us fix it? No. The answer came so calmly that she almost missed its importance. Why? Because if I walk back into that building and start fixing things, everyone will wait for me to solve the next problem. That's the system I'm trying not to rebuild. Julianne looked toward the window. So what do we do? Wesley thought about Nolan's bridge on the kitchen table. Create a place where the disagreement happens before the promise is made. Give that function enough authority to stop a commitment when the pieces don't line up. And don't make one person personally responsible for holding the entire system together. Julianne wrote the words down. Would you run that function? Wesley shook his head, even though she couldn't see him. Not for you. She paused. For yourself? Maybe someday. That answer stayed with her. Wesley wasn't waiting for an invitation anymore. He had started thinking about what he wanted his own work to look like. He wanted fewer emergencies. More time with Nolan. A role where he could solve operational problems without becoming the person everyone depended on to keep the entire company from falling apart. Meanwhile, the conference room at Julianne's office emptied slowly. Grant remained behind. You don't think I can handle this, he said. Julianne looked at him. I think I gave you authority before I understood what that authority required. Grant frowned. Wesley would have handled it differently. This isn't about Wesley. She gathered the papers. It's about whether our structure makes it possible for anyone to succeed. Grant looked frustrated, but he didn't argue. Julianne knew the conversation wasn't finished. That afternoon, she went to the client herself. She expected a hard meeting. Instead, the operations director asked one question. Who should we trust to give us the final answer? Julianne didn't have a name. That was the problem. She didn't promise Wesley would return. She didn't blame Grant. She didn't promise a discount or special treatment. She said, we're rebuilding the decision process before we ask you to trust the result. It was the first honest answer she'd given the client since the problem began. The client agreed to review the plan when it was ready. That evening, Julianne returned to her office and opened the old organization chart. Wesley's name wasn't on it anymore. For years, she had assumed removing one person would create a vacancy that someone else could fill. Now she understood the deeper problem. The company had never built a structure capable of carrying the responsibility that Wesley had quietly carried for years. The next morning, Julianne scheduled a board meeting. This time, she wasn't preparing a defense of her nephew. She was preparing to explain why the system she had created needed to change. And for the first time since Wesley walked away, the question wasn't whether she could get him back. It was whether she could build a company that didn't need one man to hold it together. The board meeting began at 8 in the morning, and Julianne walked into the room carrying no presentation about revenue growth or market expansion. She carried a single folder labeled Client Transition Review. Grant sat near the end of the table, quiet for once. Before we discuss the frozen account, Julianne said, I need to explain why we created the problem. She put the old and new organizational charts side by side. The board members studied them. We increased decision speed, she continued. But we separated authority from accountability. People could make commitments without owning the consequences, while others were still expected to deliver those commitments. One board member asked, Are you saying Wesley Hart was right? Julianne shook her head. I'm saying the structure was wrong. Wesley understood the weakness before I did. Grant shifted in his chair. And what happens to my position? Julianne looked at him. You keep it, if you can lead within the new structure. Grant seemed surprised. She wasn't protecting him because he was family. She was giving him the same opportunity she had denied Wesley authority that came with clearly defined responsibility. After the meeting, Julianne drove to the co-working office where Wesley had been working. He was surprised to see her waiting downstairs. She handed him a folder. "What's this?" "The structure I should have built before I asked you to stay." Wesley opened it. There were new decision rights guidelines, a cross-functional transition function, and a requirement that client commitments be reviewed by the people responsible for delivering them. He looked up. "You changed the whole division." "I changed the part that was broken." "And Grant still leading it?" Wesley nodded. That mattered. Julianne hadn't solved the problem by replacing one person with another. She had changed the rules. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Wesley closed the folder. "Nothing." Julianne smiled faintly. "I expected that." He looked at her. "You came here because you wanted me to come back." "I did. And now?" She took a breath. "Now I think you should decide whether you want anything to do with us." Wesley looked toward the window. Denver's October wind pushed leaves along the sidewalk. He thought about the long hours he had spent inside that company. He thought about Nolan asking whether he would get another job. He thought about how strange it felt to have choices again. "I don't want my old job," he said. Julianne nodded. "I understand. But I might be willing to review the new transition framework as an outside consultant." Julianne smiled. "On your terms." "On clear terms." Neither of them called it a victory. There was no apology designed for an audience, no dramatic handshake for the board. Julianne had finally understood that respecting Wesley's boundary didn't mean convincing him to return. It meant allowing him to decide what came next. And Wesley understood something too. Walking away had protected his dignity, but it had also forced him to confront his own habit of becoming indispensable. He didn't want his future to depend on being the person who quietly held everything together. He wanted a system where people could do their jobs without needing one person to carry everyone else's responsibility. As they walked toward the elevator, Julianne stopped. "For what it's worth, you were never difficult because you asked too many questions." Wesley looked at her. "What was I difficult about?" "You made me answer questions I didn't want to answer." Wesley smiled. "Those are usually the important ones." 2 weeks later, the client returned to the conference room with a simple condition. They wanted to see the new decision process in action before releasing the frozen contract. Wesley sat at the side of the table as an outside advisor, not an employee. His role was deliberately limited. He could ask questions, challenge assumptions, and point out gaps, but he could not make decisions for the teams. Julianne had insisted on that distinction. The first test came when engineering proposed a revised installation date. Operations said it was possible. Compliance had one concern about the inspection window. Grant wanted to approve the date immediately. Wesley looked at the schedule, but said nothing. Julianne noticed. "Wesley," she asked, "you don't need me to answer that." Grant looked at the documents. "Then who does?" Wesley pointed toward the transition manager. "That's their call. They own the handoff now." The room went quiet. Months earlier, Wesley would have stepped in immediately. He would have gathered the right people, fixed the conflict, and carried the responsibility himself. This time he waited. The transition manager asked engineering to confirm one item, asked compliance for a written clearance, and pushed the client commitment back by 24 hours. It wasn't flashy. Nobody applauded. But the next morning, every team had the same information, and the client approved the schedule. Julianne watched the process from the back of the room. The system had worked without Wesley carrying it. That mattered more than getting him back. Later that afternoon, Grant approached Wesley in the hallway. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Were you always this careful?" Wesley smiled. "Probably too careful sometimes." Grant looked uncomfortable. "I thought you were trying to block me." "I wasn't." "I know that now." Wesley waited. Grant continued. "I thought being the person with final authority meant I had to have the fastest answer." Wesley shook his head. "Sometimes the strongest answer is waiting until the right people have spoken." Grant looked toward the conference room. "That sounds slower." "It is." Wesley smiled. "Until you compare it with fixing the same mistake 3 times. Grant laughed quietly. It was the first easy conversation they had ever had. Meanwhile, Julianne received the client's formal confirmation. The contract freeze was lifted. The division had not been rescued by Wesley. It had been forced to become stronger because Wesley was no longer there to compensate for its weaknesses. That distinction stayed with her. She called the board chair and told him the client had returned. He congratulated her. Then he asked, "Is Hart coming back?" Julianne looked through the glass wall toward the office where Wesley was reviewing the new framework. Not as an employee. Then why is he there? She thought for a moment. Because we finally learned how to use his experience without making him responsible for everyone else. That evening, Wesley drove home before sunset. The weather had turned colder, and a dry wind moved through the streets. He found Nolan at the kitchen table wearing a red hoodie, working on a school assignment. "How was work?" Nolan asked. Wesley hung his light jacket by the door. "Different. Good different." Wesley considered it. "Yeah, good different." Nolan pushed a worksheet toward him. "I don't understand this part." Wesley sat beside him. "Let's figure it out." They worked together for a few minutes. Wesley noticed something he hadn't expected. He wasn't thinking about the company. He wasn't wondering whether Julianne would call again. He wasn't replaying the meeting where he had walked away. He was simply there. That was the freedom he had wanted without knowing how to name it. He had spent years believing responsibility meant being the person who stayed late, answered every call, and prevented everyone else's mistakes. Now he understood something simpler. Responsibility also meant knowing what belonged to you, what belonged to someone else, and when to step back. The next morning, Julianne sent him the final advisory agreement. It contained no employment offer, no special title, and no obligation to return to the division. Wesley read it over. Coffee. The terms were clear. The boundaries were clear. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to negotiate himself into a larger role. He signed as an independent advisor, closed his laptop, and called Nolan's school to confirm he could pick him up that afternoon. His work had changed. More importantly, his definition of success had changed with it. By the end of October, the division was no longer being measured by how quickly it could make decisions. It was being measured by whether those decisions could survive contact with reality. The client had released the contract freeze. Grant remained in his leadership role, but the approval process had changed. Transition managers had real authority. Engineering and operations were expected to challenge commitments before they reached the customer. And Julianne had stopped asking who was responsible when something went wrong. She had started asking whether the structure had made the right decision possible in the first place. Wesley watched the changes from a distance. He still advised the company when his schedule allowed, but he no longer carried the emotional weight of its problems home with him. That was perhaps the biggest change of all. One Friday afternoon, Julianne asked him to meet her for coffee. They sat near the window of a small cafe downtown, both dressed for the cold Denver afternoon. Julianne wore a dark wool coat over her business clothes. Wesley wore his brown jacket over a gray sweater. "The board approved the new structure," she said. "Good. Grant's doing well." Wesley smiled. "Good." Julianne looked at him. "You really don't need to know anything else, do you?" Wesley laughed. "I'm learning not to." She stirred her coffee. "I owe you an apology." Wesley didn't interrupt. "Not because I put Grant over you," she continued. "I had the authority to make that decision. I was wrong because I expected you to carry the consequences without giving you the authority needed to do the job responsibly." Wesley nodded. "That's a fair apology." Julianne smiled. "I wasn't sure you'd say that. I'm not interested in making you feel worse." She looked down at the table. "You know what surprised me most?" "What?" "You never tried to prove you were indispensable." Wesley thought about that. "I almost did. But you didn't. I realized being indispensable isn't the same as being valuable." Julianne looked at him for a moment. "That's a lesson most executives learn too late." Wesley finished his coffee. "Most people learn it somewhere." Outside, a cold wind moved fallen leaves along the sidewalk. Wesley checked his phone. Nolan's school had sent a reminder about an evening parent event. He stood. "I should go." Julianne nodded. "Of course." At the door, she called after him. "Wesley." He turned. "Thank you for walking away." He gave her a puzzled look. "That's not what I expected you to say." "I know," Julianne said. "But if you had stayed, I might never have understood what was wrong." Wesley smiled. "Then I guess leaving helped both of us." He stepped outside and headed toward his truck. There was no dramatic celebration waiting for him. No new title. No expensive reward. His life had not suddenly become perfect. He was still a single father managing school schedules, bills, grocery lists, and the ordinary pressure of making sure a child felt safe and loved. But he had learned that protecting his boundaries did not make him difficult. It made him honest about what he could responsibly carry. And perhaps that is the part of this story worth holding on to. We often judge people by the size of their paycheck, the clothes they wear, the neighborhood they live in, or the title printed on their business card. We assume the person with money must be more important and the person struggling financially must somehow be less worthy. That judgment is wrong. A wealthy CEO deserves respect because she is human. A working single father deserves the same respect because he is human. Being poor does not make someone foolish, lazy, disposable, or beneath anyone else. And being powerful does not make someone automatically right. Julianne had authority, but she still had to learn humility. Wesley had less power inside the company, but he never lost his dignity. At home that evening, Nolan ran to the door when Wesley arrived. "Dad." Wesley caught him in a quick hug. "Hey, buddy." Nolan pulled back. "You coming to my school thing?" "Wouldn't miss it." Wesley locked the door behind them. Outside, the October wind moved through the trees. Inside, his son was waiting for him. Wesley had walked away from a job because he refused to surrender his responsibility without a voice. What he gained wasn't a bigger title. It was something quieter, the freedom to choose his work, protect his time, and still know his worth when nobody in a boardroom was measuring it. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is not demand a seat at someone else's table. It is knowing when to stand, walk away, and build a life where respect is part of the foundation.